Montana Territory, spring of 1878. The wind howled low across the dry grass when Marshal Merritt Hale rode into Alderbend with dust on his coat and a bullet crease in his hat. He was not looking for a wife. He was looking for a place to rest a broken rib, maybe trade his worn gelding for a sounder one. But as his boots hit the dirt in front of the mercantile, he caught sight of 5 boys wrestling in the street, half covered in flour, and one woman yelling from the porch of the boarding house like she had lived through war. "Valin, Vero, get your brothers off the road before they get flattened by a cart. I swear on your father's grave." Merritt paused. The boys scattered like pigeons, but the woman stood firm, hands on hips, skirts dusted with flour, and apron hiked up one side. She was young 20s, maybe, but her eyes looked older, like they had seen too much too soon. Her name was Zadie Sutton, and everyone in Alderbend knew her as the widow with 5 hell-raising boys and a spine like tempered steel. Merritt stepped into the mercantile, but he could not keep his eyes from drifting through the window back toward her. She was scolding the youngest boy, who clutched a dented tin pan like a shield. The older ones hung back, sheepish. One of them noticed Merritt watching and straightened, chin high like a man. "Who's that?" the boy asked. Zadie answered flatly. "Trouble, probably." Zadie was not wrong. Merritt had not stayed put anywhere for more than a month in 6 years. Since the war, since his older brother died in the uniform of the Confederacy and his father drank himself into a pine box, Merritt had chased bad men across bad lands, always leaving before anything could root. But something about that woman with her 5 boys and her fire-worn eyes knocked the wind out of him. He saw her again outside the church that Sunday. The town kept their distance, as they always did. Zadie had married too young, and her husband had died in an accident at the mill 3 years back. Folks said she should have packed up and gone east to her sister. Said no decent man would want another man's 5 sons. But she stayed. She raised them. She worked harder than any man Merritt had ever met. And not once did he see her flinch. "Ma'am," he said after service, touching the brim of his hat. She narrowed her eyes. "You planning to stay in Alderbend, or just passing through?" He shrugged. "Depends." "On what?" "Whether or not you let me fix that busted porch rail of yours." He saw the flicker of surprise behind her guarded stare. Then she gave a hard nod. "You want to work for supper, fine. But I do not need help raising my boys." "Did not say you did." By the end of the week, Merritt had fixed the rail, rehung the front door, and patched the roof of the chicken shed. He took his meals on the back steps with the boys, who slowly warmed to him. Valin, the eldest at 12, watched him like a hawk, testing every move. Vero, 10, asked questions that never stopped. The twins, Vaughn and Vernon, age 7, followed Merritt around like shadows. And little Vesper, just 5, told him solemnly that Merritt snored like a bear. Zadie never asked him to stay, but when he saddled his horse to leave, Vero ran after him with a pair of socks and thrust them into his hands. "Ma made these. She does not give socks to cowboys. Only to family." Merritt stared at the thick wool in his hands, then looked up to see Zadie on the porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "I can be useful," he said, "if you give me the chance." She hesitated, then nodded once. "Stay in the barn. You earn your meals." The town laughed when he started walking those boys to school, when he stood beside Zadie at Sunday service, when he brought her wildflowers and fixed her fence and taught the twins how to ride. "Look at that fool," they said, taking on another man's 5 boys like they were his own. But Merritt did not care. He saw the way Zadie's shoulders eased when he was around, how Vesper crawled into his lap at night without asking, how Valin started calling him sir, with respect instead of suspicion. One night, after the boys were asleep and the wind was curling around the eaves, Zadie met him on the porch. "You are not their father," she said softly. "You do not owe us anything." "I know," Merritt said, "but I want to be, if you will let me." Her fingers trembled as they reached for his. "I spent so long building walls, Merritt. I do not know how to let anyone in." He lifted her hand, kissed her knuckles. "Then I will wait on the porch until you do." The next week, Valin got into a fight at school. Merritt found him bloody-nosed and angry behind the schoolhouse. He said Ma was a joke, said she chased off every man who ever tried to help. Merritt crouched beside him. "You and your brothers are the best thing that ever happened to her, and I would be proud to be your pa, if you would let me." Valin blinked hard. "You mean that?" "I do. In late summer, Merritt asked Zadie to marry him. She said yes with tears in her eyes and her hands in his. The town laughed, said it would never last. But on the day of the wedding, 5 boys stood beside Merritt in clean shirts and combed hair, grinning like lightning. And when the circuit preacher asked who gave the bride away, Valen stepped forward and said, "We do." Zadie's hands were shaking when she placed them in Merritt's. But her voice was steady when she whispered, "I never thought I would feel safe again." Merritt smiled. "You are home now." That night, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the boys snored in their beds, Zadie curled into Merritt's arms and whispered, "They call you Pa now." "And I will earn it every day," he said, kissing her temple. "Every day for the rest of my life." She looked up at him, eyes full of love. "I think the town is done laughing." "Let them," he said, pulling her close. "We have everything we need right here." And they did. The first frost settled over Alderbend in the dark hours between midnight and morning. Merritt had risen before the sun, boots quiet on the kitchen floorboards, hands calloused and careful as he sliced apples for Zadie's pie crust. He didn't cook much, but he knew the rhythm of a blade and the patience of waiting till things softened just right. From the back room came the soft thump of Vesper dropping from his bunk to the floor, then the creak of the door as he padded out, hair sticking in all directions. "Ma said not to come out till the rooster, but I think he forgot," Vesper whispered. Merritt lifted him onto the stool by the stove. "Then I reckon we're both outlaws today." Vesper grinned, missing a front tooth, and took a slice of apple without asking. By the time the others stirred, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and black coffee. Zadie came in last, her braids still damp from the basin, cardigan pulled tight. She paused in the doorway as the boys jostled for stools. Merritt didn't look up. "You've got flour behind your ear." She lifted a hand to swipe it away, but her eyes lingered on him. "You're up early." Old habits. Cold nights make for early mornings. Vera was already tugging at his sleeve. "You said you'd show us how to fix a wagon yoke today." "I will," Merritt said, "but only after your chores are done and your ma says your hands are clean." Zadie moved to the counter, brushing her fingers over the edge of the rolling pin he'd left out. "They'll be clean. You can count on that." That afternoon, Merritt stood with Valen under the cottonwood by the barn, the old wagon stripped down to its bones. Valen held the chisel like it was something sacred, and Merritt didn't rush him. "Don't force it," he said. "Let the grain tell you where it wants to go." Valen squinted. "How'd you learn all this?" "Had to. When my brother died, someone had to keep the place running. I was younger than you are now." He hadn't meant to say it, but the words hung there like breath in cold air. Valen didn't ask more. He just nodded, turned the chisel slightly, and pressed down. Inside, Zadie was mending a neighbor's coat to earn a little extra. She'd taken in sewing again, not out of need so much as habit. Years of scraping by didn't tumble away just because vows had been spoken. Vaughn and Vernon were helping her sort buttons by size, their small fingers quick and sure. She paused, listening to the rhythm of the mallet outside, the steady scrape of wood against wood, and something in her chest eased. Later that week, Merritt was pulling fence posts with Vero when the boy asked, "Did you ever live in a big city?" "No. Closest I ever came was St. Louis, and I didn't take to it." "Why not?" "Too many folks pretending to be something they're not. I like places where a man's word still means something." Vero nodded like he understood. "I think if you say something, you should keep it." Merritt looked at him carefully. "I feel the same." That night, the wind picked up, and the chimney moaned low. Merritt sat on the floor near the hearth, carving a small horse from pine for Vesper's birthday. Zadie watched from her chair, a blanket over her knees, her knitting needles quiet for once. "You always make something when they sleep," she said. "Gives me time to think." "About what?" He turned the carving in his hand. "How to be good for them." "For you." She set the blanket aside, her gaze steady. "You already are." He didn't answer, just reached over and placed the carved horse on the mantel. "Still, I like to be sure." The next morning, Valen returned from the well with news that the schoolteacher had taken ill. Miss Culver was older, lived alone in a cabin past the ridge. Zadie stood in the doorway, arms folded. "She's got no kin nearby? Someone ought to check on her." "I'll go," Merritt said. Zadie raised an eyebrow. "You sure you can find her place?" He pulled on his coat. "You gave me enough directions to reach Kansas." He left before breakfast, returned afternoon with Miss Culver bundled in blankets on the back of his horse. She had a fever and little food left. Zadie set up a cot in the parlor and fed her broth while Merritt rubbed warmth back into her hands. Afterward, Zadie brought Merritt a cup of chicory near the barn, her voice low. You didn't have to do that. He took the cup from her, fingers brushing hers. Didn't sit right, leaving her alone out there. She nodded once, then looked up at him. You're not what I expected. Merritt was quiet for a moment. I never planned to be here this long, but I'm glad I stayed. Zadie's eyes softened. So am I. That night, as the boys settled into their beds and the fire burned low, Merritt found her on the back porch, wrapped in her shawl. She didn't turn when he sat beside her, but her hand found his in the dark. I used to think the quiet meant I was alone, she said. He pulled her hand to his chest. Not anymore. No, she whispered. Not anymore. The stream behind the Sutton land ran slow in early November, its edges crusted with ice by dawn. Merritt stood beside it with his boots sunk in the brittle grass, eyes on the sky where geese passed in a shifting wedge. He had a snare line set along the willow edge, not because they needed meat, they had a butchered hog hanging in the smokehouse, but because he liked knowing how the land moved when no one was watching. A hand tugged his coat hem. Ma said I could come help, but only if I don't talk too loud, Vesper whispered. You think the rabbits scare off easy? Merritt bent to his level. Vesper nodded solemnly, then tiptoed like a fox across the frost-stiff ground. The snare held a single hair, its fur clean and pale. Merritt dispatched it quick, offering quiet thanks. Vesper didn't flinch. He just watched, lips pressed tight, then reached for the twine with careful fingers. Reckon I can reset it? He asked. Go ahead, Merritt said. It's yours now. By the time they walked back to the house, the sun had cleared the ridge, and chimney smoke curled steady into the brightening sky. Inside, Zadie was placing a wrapped parcel into her mending basket. Her hands paused when she saw the rabbit. Looks like we'll have stew tomorrow, she said. Vesper beamed. I set the snare. Merritt leaned against the doorframe, watching her tuck the package deeper under folded cloth. You heading into town? Zadie brushed her palms clean. Mrs. Cormack's boy tore the shoulder out of his jacket again. They don't have coin, but she offered eggs and a length of muslin. I'll walk with you, Merritt said. She didn't argue. The road to town was slick in places where the sun hadn't touched. Merritt kept his pace even, letting her lead where the path narrowed. Oaks stood bare along the fence lines, and somewhere close, a crow called once then went quiet. You been quiet this morning, Zadie said finally. Been thinking. She waited. I never asked what you wanted for this winter. For the house. For the boys. I've been patching fences and chopping wood, but I never asked. She adjusted her shawl. Winter wants don't change much. Warm beds. Dry boots. A full root cellar. That all. Her breath hung in the air. Maybe a little more laughter. Less worry. He nodded. I can work on that. Zadie stopped walking, half turned toward him. I'm not used to someone asking. I'm not used to having someone worth asking for. Her eyes softened, but she didn't say more, just started walking again. That evening, the boys gathered around the table with hands scrubbed raw from the pump. Vaughn was missing a tooth now, knocked loose in a scuffle with Vernon over who'd fed the chickens last. The matter had been settled with a firm word from Zadie and a shared chore list on the wall, written in Valen's sharp hand. After supper, Merritt and Valen hauled the washtub near the fire. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows, but inside the walls held firm. Zadie knelt beside the stove, folding the muslin from Mrs. Cormack, her thumb tracing the weave. Fine cloth, Merritt said. She said it had been her mother's, Zadie answered. I told her I'd mend coats for nothing, but she insisted. Folk like to feel they still have something to give. She looked up. You know that from experience? I do. The firelight caught her face then, and something in her expression shifted less guarded, more wondering. You ever thought about settling for good? She asked. He set the bucket down. I already have. She looked at him for a long stretch, then nodded once like she'd tucked that away somewhere private. Before bed, Merritt sat with Vero on the floor, the boys slayed across his knees. What's this one? Merritt asked, pointing to the drawing etched in chalk. A trap, like yours, but it's for foxes. I read about it in Mr. Thayer's book. Fox traps take different bait. I was thinking dried fish. Smart. Vero looked up. You think I could make one when I'm older? Merritt met his gaze. I think you'll make anything you put your mind to. The boy's shoulders squared just a little. I want to do something that helps. You already do. Later, when the house quieted, Merritt climbed into bed beside Zadie without a word. She turned toward him in the dark, her hands searching for his beneath the quilt. You think the boys are happy? She whispered. They are. Even Valen. He watches everything. But he's not waiting for me to leave anymore. She was quiet, then said, I used to count days by what went wrong. What do you count now? She shifted close, her voice low. Warmth. Breathing. You. He kissed her forehead, and her breath caught. I'll make sure you never count fear again, he said. She didn't answer, but she curled tighter into him, and he held her until sleep came like snow, slow, quiet, and certain. The first snow came in the night, quiet as breath. Merritt woke early, as always, and stood at the window while the sky turned from slate to pearl. The yard lay blanketed in white, unbroken but for a set of rabbit tracks near the woodpile. He dressed without noise, pulling on his coat and boots, then stepped outside into the stillness. By the time he returned with an armful of kindling, Zadie was by the stove stirring cornmeal mush, her sleeves pushed up and hair still damp at the ends. She didn't speak as he set the wood down, but when he sat beside her, she reached for his hand and held it for a moment without looking. I heard from Rose, she said. She wrote from Ohio. Says her youngest is apprenticing with a printer, and her husband's taken on work near the river. Merritt watched the flame flicker behind the stove grate. She still wants you to come east? She writes like she's asking a question, but I know it's meant as concern. Zadie ladled mush into the bowls laid out on the table. She's always thought I stayed because I had nowhere else. You stayed because you're made of bedrock, he said quietly. She can think what she wants. Zadie set the ladle down. I used to think I had to prove something to her, but not anymore. From the back room came the sound of Vernon's boots thudding to the floor, followed by Vaughn's voice insisting the snow would be deep enough for sledding. Zadie's eyes lifted toward the noise, then back to Merritt. You think you could take them up the ridge this afternoon? I was hoping you'd ask. Later, after the boys had eaten, Zadie sent them out with scarves and mittens she'd mended the night before. Merritt stayed behind to help Valen finish securing the back latch on the henhouse door. The wind had loosened the hinge, and the latch hung crooked. Valen crouched beside the wooden frame, one hand steadying the hook while the other hammered. Pa, can I ask you something? Anything. Valen drove the nail in slow, careful. If someone says something about Ma in town, and it's not kind, do I always have to walk away? Merritt knelt beside him. Did someone say something to you? 2 men outside the mill. They didn't see me behind the wagon. What did they say? Valen's jaw tightened. That you'd leave once the snow got deep. That Ma was making a fool of herself expecting you to stay. Merritt didn't speak at first, just reached out and checked the hinge. Then he said, words like that come from men who don't understand loyalty or love. But what do I do with it? You grow stronger than it. You take care of your family so well. Those men don't have anything left to say. Valen looked down at his hands. I feel like I'm still proving something. So do I, Merritt said. But not to them. To you. To her. The boy's voice came quieter. You already have. They finished the latch in silence. When they returned to the house, Zadie was standing by the pile of sleds near the door, brushing snow off the smallest one. She looked up as they entered. Vesper's got his mittens on the wrong hands again, she said, smiling faintly. I'll fix it, Merritt said, pulling off his gloves. They spent the afternoon on the ridge above the pasture. The boys tore down the slope in laughter and shouts, their boots kicking up powder. Merritt ran beside them more than once, helping steer the sleds away from the rocks near the tree line. Zadie stayed near the top, her hands tucked deep in her coat pockets, watching. When the sun dipped low and the wind turned sharper, they headed home red-cheeked and soaked to the knees. Merritt carried Vesper on his shoulders the last half-mile. That evening, as Zadie scrubbed the boys' socks and laid them near the stove to dry, she caught Merritt watching her from the doorway. You've got something on your mind, she said. I heard what Valen told me. About the men in town. Zadie set the last sock down. I figured he would. I want to speak plain, he said. I married you because I love you. That doesn't change with the season. Zadie stood, wiping her hands on her apron. I know what they say. I've heard it since the day he died. That I should have gone east, that no man would take this on. Merritt stepped closer, But I'm not just any man. No, she said, her voice steady. You're mine. He touched her cheek, rough fingers gentle. And you're mine. Let the town talk. We'll outlast the wind. From the back room came Vero's voice, asking if the stew was done. Zadie turned her head slightly, then looked back at Merritt. Can you ladle out bowls? Of course. She watched him go, then picked up the last sock and draped it over the warming rail. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft as cotton, and inside, the warmth of the fire reached the corners of every room. The wind changed near the end of January, sharp and dry with a bite that carried dust instead of snow. The drifts around the barn had crusted over, and the water buckets needed breaking each morning. Merritt moved slower than usual, favoring his left shoulder, bruised from hauling a stubborn ewe out of a frozen ditch 2 days prior. He hadn't said much about it, but Zadie noticed the way he winced when chopping wood and how he rolled his shoulder when he thought no one was looking. She didn't press him until the boys were outside feeding chickens and Valen had taken the twins to check the traps. You need to rest that arm, she said as she set a kettle on the stove. I will, he answered, not looking up from the ledger where he was marking out new seed orders. Once the chores are done, Zadie reached for the cloth draped over the back of the chair and folded it slow. You've done more than enough. His pencil paused. That ledger's not just mine anymore. She crossed the room and laid her hand on the page, gently moving it aside. Nothing in this house is just yours or mine. It's ours. That means you don't have to carry it all when something gives out. His eyes met hers then, quiet and steady. I'm still learning how to let go of old habits. Zadie softened. Then we'll learn together. That night, they ate late. The boys had brought back a pair of hares and were still bickering over whose snare had held. As they sat around the table, Merritt passed Vesper another spoonful of beans and caught Zadie's gaze across the rim of his cup. There was a question there, not urgent, just waiting. After the dishes were cleared and the boys were tucked in, she met him on the back step, wrapped in her heavier shawl. The stars were clear, sharp as needles in the black sky. I heard from the land agent, she said after a while. The small parcel east of the stream, the one with the poplars? It's available. Merritt folded his hands between his knees. You thinking of buying? I'm thinking we could fence it for planting. Keep the boys out of the steep ground come spring. He nodded. That soil's good. Not too rocky. We need to clear the bramble first. I've already traded for a team to help with that. The Andersons' oldest has a yoke they're not using. He turned toward her, surprise flickering in his eyes. You planned all that without me? She leaned her shoulder into his. I didn't need to ask. I knew you'd say yes. He covered her hand with his. You were right. The next week, Merritt rode into town with Valen to place the seed order and collect a spool of brass wire for fencing. At the general store, Mr. Harlan asked after the boys and offered a coil of rope at no charge. On the ride back, Valen spoke up. I've been thinking about staying on the land when I'm grown. Merritt adjusted the reins. You thinking about a house of your own? Maybe, but not far. Valen looked out over the snow-laced trees. Feels like something worth staying for. Merritt didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low. That's all a man can hope for. Something worth staying for. When they returned, Zadie was in the garden rows with Vero and Vaughn, marking the new fence line with stakes. She'd tied a red kerchief around her braid to keep the wind off her ears. It fluttered as she stood to meet them. You're back earlier than I expected, she said. Valen kept the pace sharp, Merritt replied, dismounting. We'll have this row marked by sundown, she said, brushing her hands clean on her apron. I'll take the next row, Merritt offered. She stepped aside, giving him the measuring cord. We can finish faster together. By dusk, the posts were laid. The boys ran ahead to the house, laughing, their boots kicking through the snow that had turned wet at the edges. Zadie and Merritt lingered near the stream where the last stake stood. You remember the first time you came here? She asked. The porch rail was falling off. One of the twins had a black eye. You looked like you'd just stared down a thunderstorm. I had, she said, voice soft. But you didn't flinch. He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his chest caught. That day changed everything. Zadie touched his coat sleeve. I want to build something that lasts. Not just a house or a fence. A life. You already have, he said. I'm just lucky I got to step into it. She reached up, brushing the snow from his collar. You didn't step in. You built it with me. He kissed her then, slow and certain, under the bare-limbed trees while the last light of day faded behind the hills. That spring, the fence went up fast. The boys helped dig post holes, and Zadie traded baked goods for extra hands. They planted beans, turnips, and early corn. By late June, the poplar grove shaded rows of green shoots, and the soil smelled rich and alive. The house was louder now, guitars on Sundays, boys wrestling in the grass, and laughter spilling through open windows. Merritt taught Valen how to sharpen a plow blade, and Zadie showed Vernon how to hem without puckering the fabric. They wrote to Rose, telling her she should visit when the tomatoes came in. One evening, as the sun slipped low and the boys chased fireflies across the yard, Merritt wrapped an arm around Zadie's waist and pulled her close. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. "I do," she said, resting her head against his shoulder. "But I don't need it to be anything more than this." "This is more than I ever hoped for," he said. She smiled against his shirt. "Then we're lucky." The stars came out one by one, slow and steady, and the house behind them glowed with warmth. Merritt watched the boys on the lawn, saw Vesper catch a firefly and cup it gently in his hands. He looked back at Zadie. "We built something good." She nodded. "And we'll keep building. Together." And they did. For every season that followed, through every harvest and every winter, they stayed. Not because they had nowhere to go, but because they had everything they needed right there. A home, a family, and the kind of love that didn't ask for anything more than to be held, day by day, in the quiet hours and the noisy ones too.